The Cult during their 4-decade history have went through a lot of turbulent times, while also releasing some of the most popular rock records of the 80s. Today, let's take a look at the complicated history of the band. The Cult would be born out of the UK's post-punk movement. Frontman Ian Astbury would front the band The Southern Death Cult and would partner up with guitarist Billy Duffy, who played in the band Theatre of Hate. By Astbury's own admission to Canada's Much More Music TV channel, his bandmates in the Southern Death Cult were more into getting girls than playing actual music, and having already met Duffy, he was in awe of the guitarist's musicianship. It was following the dissolution of Southern Death Cult that Astbury hopped on a bus and traveled to London with sheets of lyrics to meet Duffy and talk to him about forming their own band, which they did called Death Cult. Their name would eventually be shortened to simply The Cult, so people wouldn't mischaracterize the band's style of music. Enlisting drummer Nigel Preston and bassist Jamie Stewart, the band would release their debut album Dreamtime in 1984. That was a modest success on the indie charts, selling around 60,000 copies, with the song Spirit Walker topping the UK indie dance charts. Despite a solid start, the Cult hadn't yet zeroed in on their sound. That would come with their next release, 1985's Love. But the band would look back a decade to find inspiration, with frontman Ian Astbury telling Louder Sound how himself and Duffy were rebels in what they wanted to do at the time, recalling there were certain guidelines in the post-punk new wave movement, and that was to stay clearly away from long hair and guitar solos. So for us, that was like, great, that's exactly where we're going to start. If that's where we're not supposed to be according to some journalists, then that's exactly where we're starting. I wanted to find out what the taboo was all about. Then you hear Jimi Hendrix and Led Zeppelin and The Doors, and suddenly it's like, what is this? We're not supposed to listen to this? You're kidding me. We've always had a punk rock attitude, but it's less reactionary and more dynamic. The band would assemble in Barnes, London at Olympic Studios to cut their first track for their new album. The plan was to work with Susie and the Banshees producer Steve Lillywhite, but due to a misunderstanding with their label, the band soon found themselves in the studio with Wham producer Steve Brown. Which should have been an unproductive recording session, resulted in the perfect pairing between the band and producer. It was at these sessions that the band recorded the song She Sells Sanctuary, which gave the Cult one of their biggest hit songs of their career. The track would peak at number 15 on the UK charts. It was a song that came together fairly quickly, with Astbury recalling in 2010. Sanctuary came together very easily. In fact, I took the bass line from a song called Spirit Walker. Billy came up with the melody as he worked out a vaguely psychedelic guitar sound which seemed to fit in well. We were heavily into the 60s psychedelic music. The producer Steve Brown had a lot of pop success, so we really knew how to structure a song. It's funny, you write a song like that where everything comes together far beyond what you would have expected, and then you spend the rest of your life trying to write another one as good. As for what the song was about, Astbury, according to Songfacts, was quoted as saying, "Sex, plain and simple, it's about sex. I've had sex and I'm very proud of that fact." The band would end up giving drummer Nigel Preston the boot following his erratic behavior, and enlisting a new drummer to spend 4 weeks in the summer of 1985 recording Love. The lyrics of the album would be introspective, dealing with subjects ranging from life and death to spirituality and materialism. Love would end up selling north of 2 million copies and produce several hits, including She Sells Sanctuary, Rain, and Revolution. Despite the band's new commercial success, to some who hailed the band's early releases, what they were doing bordered on treason. Bands weren't supposed to embrace groups like Led Zeppelin and The Doors, and do it so openly, with Astbury telling Louder Sound. I remember going out when She Sells Sanctuary got in the charts, and some kid came up and punched me right in the face at a concert. There was so much hatred in his eyes, and all that was because we came from the streets in Brixton. We came from punk rock, and I think the guy saw us as breaking the code by not pretending we couldn't play our instruments or having success. Electric would represent the Cult's third album and follow up to their commercial breakthrough 1985's Love. Electric represented a stylistic change for the British band, whose previous sound had been more representative of gothic and psychedelic rock. Electric was an album that was stripped down rock and roll, but the road to get there was long and expensive. As producer Steve Brown, who worked on the album, told Louder Sound, Ian just lost interest in reverb, echo, big wall of noise thing we'd done on Love. He lost interest in it almost before we'd started recording, and got even less interested in it as we went along. For the group's third album, they would team up again with Love producer Steve Brown, but something was happening in the music scene between 1986 and 1987, and the members of the Cult took notice. Heavy metal and hard rock grew in popularity thanks to the likes of Metallica, Megadeth, as well as Slayer, who all released seminal albums in 1986, and of course the following year you had Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction. The Cult would see it as an opportunity. In 1986, the LA Times interviewed the members of the band on their Love tour, where they talked about how some radio stations were ignoring the group, despite Love being a commercial success. The paper would read, and I quote, "Asbury was also discouraged because the cult hasn't received the radio play in America he thinks it deserves," with the singer revealing, "It's really frustrating, especially in the Midwest. You go to these radio stations that are basically playing rock music, which is what we do in the broadest sense of the word, yet they won't pick up on us because of the name or the image." The article was onto something. The band's image was in stark contrast to what was popular at the time. The cult would embrace the 60s counterculture look with paisley shirts, love beads, peace pins, and of course American Indian imagery. Asbury would reveal in the same interview why the band identified with the 60s so much, revealing, "In the 1960s, people really ran their own lives. They were fed up with what old people were doing, and they decided to use their imaginations and to do something like explore every aspect of life, fashion being one of them. They pooled their resources with clothes from all different periods and different cultures, and then all of a sudden it became uncool to be imaginative. Everyone went bland and boring. Recently, most people haven't been using their imaginations enough. By the summer of 1986, the band had recorded about a dozen songs, which became known as the Manor Sessions at Richard Branson's studio in the Oxfordshire countryside. Compared to their previous album Love, the band had a lot more money to burn through in the studio, and that they did. The album at the time was tentatively titled Peace, and the sessions harkened back to the band's sound on Love, but the cult were unhappy with how the tracks turned out. Guitarist Billy Duffy would tell the Sabotage Times in 2013, "The songs were too long and just felt bloated and self-indulgent. We'd gone back to the studio too soon, as the label wanted us to keep laying golden eggs. In reality, we should have kept rehearsing and gone through a pre-production process. We knew something was not right, but didn't quite know what it was. I remember listening to the replay of the album at the Townhouse Studios and thinking, we're doomed." The band wanted to re-record the album, and it was during their tour to promote Love that frontman Ian Astbury, who was 24 at the time, was at a Toronto nightclub and heard the Beastie Boys track Cookie Puss, recalling to Rolling Stone, "I was blown away by how raw and naked it was. Those productions had no agenda other than to rock, as you would say." It was then that Astbury realized that the band's sound was in stark contrast to the hard life they were living on the road. The band soon sought out producer Rick Rubin, who in addition to the Beastie Boys, cut his teeth working with Run DMC and Slayer. At the time, Rubin was still living in the NYU dorms. It was during their first meeting with Rubin, he would tell Astbury, according to Rolling Stone, "Do you want to play expletive English music or do you want to rock?" The band's focus soon shifted to becoming big in America, and along with hiring a new producer, the band made 3 more changes. They moved the recording of the album to America at Electric Ladyland Studio in New York. The band also fired their British managers and enlisted a bigwig management team from Los Angeles. And finally, the group traded in their pirate costumes for leather and denim. Some of the songs from the Peace Sessions would be re-recorded to have more of a straightforward rock and roll approach. The band would also write a handful of new tracks, including Little Devil, King Contraryman, and Memphis Hip Shake. Rubin would tell Loudersound what his ultimate goal is when producing rock bands, revealing, "When I'm producing a rock band, I try to create albums that sound as powerful as Highway to Hell. Whether it's the Cult or the Red Hot Chili Peppers, I apply the same basic formula. Keep it sparse, make the guitar parts more rhythmic. It sounds simple, but what AC/DC does is almost impossible to duplicate." Rubin would also institute some new rules for the band, including banning the use of any guitar effects and allegedly keeping guitar solos to a maximum of 30 seconds. Renamed Electric, the album would be released on April 6, 1987, and would peak at number 38 on the Billboard charts. The album would end up going double platinum, selling over 2 million copies. The Cult's 4th album, Sonic Temple, would prove to be the group's most commercially successful album, peaking at number 10 on the Billboard charts, and it would create 4 top 20 mainstream rock chart singles. Yet, it would be produced in entirely different circumstances than Electric was. You could say that Sonic Temple was a bit of a homecoming for the band and an even deeper dive into Ian Astbury's metaphysical inclinations. Although Astbury is British, he spent most of his time being brought up in eastern Canada in the province of Ontario. As a boy, he visited one of the local indigenous reserves, and it's a memory he comes back to time and time again. The exact location was the Six Nations of the Grand River in southern Ontario. With Sonic Temple, the band remained as eclectic as ever, if not in their musical style, then with their topics of these songs, covering issues ranging from teenagers in France to one of Andy Warhol's Factory Girls to the theme of the powerful yet unattainable women. There seems to be a feeling of longing throughout the album, whether that's for the past that doesn't exist anymore, or a beautiful woman who is out of reach or has even died. Sonic Temple would be recorded in Vancouver, Canada at Little Mountain Sound Recording Studio, with future future Metallica producer Bob Rock. Asbury felt a kinship with Rock as they both had Canadian roots, and he thought Bob would understand the nuances of British rock that an American producer would. The album's name comes from the bonus track Medicine Train, which features the lyrics Sonic Temple. It was clear that the band wasn't entirely happy with how electric had come out, given such a drastic change in both the producer and studio location. But the band also had another goal on their mind, becoming more established in America, with Duffy telling Louder Sound, "I was very focused personally, bound and determined that the Cult should have had a platinum album in America." Sonic Temple features a handful of iconic songs like Firewoman, Edie Chow Baby, and Sweet Soul Sister. Firewoman is about the universal symbol of the femme fatale, but is also influenced by Ian Astbury's fascination with indigenous culture. Sweet Soul Sister was written in Paris and is about the observation of the Americanization of the youth in Europe. Edie Chow Baby is about Edie Sedgwick, a socialite who formed part of the artist Andy Warhol's factory scene in New York in the 60s, who died due to an overdose in her 20s. By Duffy's own admission, the song to him underperformed in America, as he would tell Louder Sound. "I don't know what happened with that song. I really thought it would do more." A lot of the bands like Whitesnake and Def Leppard were turning down their guitars and turning up their keyboards and getting poppier around them though, and that's just not what that was. When it came time to tour on the album, the band had two options. They could either tour with Metallica or Black Sabbath. In a 2019 interview with Loudwire, Duffy explained why they chose Metallica, saying, "We thought Ozzy's crowd would be very Sabbath, Ozzy-centric, while Metallica were a young band, same age as us, and we know they're heavy, but it was an interesting tour. I went to see places in America I've never been back to since and had a lot of fun, but that was a tough one because it was the old Metallica, the pre-Black Album Metallica." As the band was about to hit the road, they had a new drummer join the band, as Mickey Curry, who played on Sonic Temple, would depart the group, and would be replaced by future Guns N' Roses drummer Matt Sorum. Even though the band was at the peak of their commercial success, things weren't great behind the scenes. Asbury was overweight and struggling with alcohol. Some nights his voice was so bad that Sorum would help him sing some of the songs. In a 2019 interview with Global News Online, Asbury talked about how the cracks in the band were forming, saying, "After Sonic Temple, the band was beginning to implode. The pressure of doing it so long, the wear and tear of the road, the pressure to create another record was all there. We should have taken a break, but we went straight into Ceremony." The 90s and 2000s proved to be a tumultuous time for the Cult. Lawsuits, death, declining record sales, their first breakup, and an underwhelming reunion proved to be a pretty rough time for the band. In 1991, the Cult released their fifth studio record, Ceremony, which was largely influenced by Native American culture. By the early 90s, Asbury and Duffy's relationship was strained, and for the first time, the pair couldn't agree on musical direction, as Duffy wanted to keep playing hard rock, while Asbury wanted to change the band's sound. Due to their musical disagreements, Ceremony is the product of compromise. The album showed some similarities with Sonic Temple, including the tracks Wild-Hearted Son and Earth Mofo, while the band's more experimental side was shown on songs like Indian. The world of popular music had undergone a massive shift since Sonic Temple was released. Ceremony would be unfortunately put out in September of 1991, which was probably the worst time to release an album, as alternative rock was on its way to dominating the charts, with several high-profile releases coming out around this time, including Pearl Jam's 10, Nirvana's Nevermind, Red Hot Chili Peppers' Blood Sugar Sex Magik. Then you had some bands from the 80s who were bigger than ever, including Metallica and Guns N' Roses, who released their own juggernaut albums around this time, including the Black Album and the Use Your Illusion records. Ceremony only peaked at number 25 on the album charts, and wouldn't even go gold. It wasn't just alternative rock hitting the Cult's album sales and pocketbook, as the band was soon involved in litigation in the summer of 1992. A lawsuit would be filed against the band by the parents of the 11-year-old child who's featured on the album's front cover, as well as in the video for the song Wild-Hearted Son. The child's parents sued the band for $61 million, claiming that the Cult hadn't got permission to use their son's image. And here's an MTV report at the time discussing the lawsuit and the Cult's response.
First, the Cult are at the center of a lawsuit over the alleged improper use of a photograph of a child used on the cover of their Ceremony album, and also as a dramatic centerpiece of their video Wild-Hearted Son, in which a snapshot is burnt. 11-year-old Sue Indian Eternity Dubray and his parents have filed the $61 million lawsuit in the American Supreme Court individually against frontman Ian Astbury and Billy Duffy, as well as the multimedia company Time Warner, Warner Brothers Records, Sire Records, and John Running, the photographer credited for the picture. Eternity first saw the image when he was flicking through the channels on American television and saw the picture on MTV, whereupon he reportedly ran screaming to his father. The picture was taken when Eternity was 4 at a tribal gathering. Running took the Polaroid shot and gave it to Eternity's parents, who assumed it was a private photo for them. The court papers allege that Running somehow got hold of a copy of the snap and sold it to the record company. The Sioux elders themselves regard the incident as yet another example of discrimination and exploitation of their culture, an opinion which would hardly make them warm to Ian Astbury's comments in an interview with music paper The NME. Quote, "The motif of the Indian child on the album cover fits in with the imagery of man rediscovering his relationship with the earth." As yet, there's no comment from the cult on the matter, but Ian Astbury is in the process of preparing a statement, so we'll keep you posted on the band
British
reaction.
rock band The Cult has responded to being sued last week by an 11-year-old Sioux Indian boy and his family for $61 million. The family claimed unauthorized use of the boy's photo on the band's latest album, Ceremony, and in a music video from the album. Cult frontman Ian Astbury, who is part Native American himself, dismisses the suit and says the band had authorization to use the photograph.
The release forms were signed and everything by the family. It was done about 8 years ago. The photograph was commercially available in the book. The photographer has retained the rights for the past 8 years. There was a commercially available poster of the image even before we were even interested in using the image. So I think it's just somebody sniffing around to try and exploit the current trend of Native Americans suing either corporations or sports teams, and in this case, a musical group. So we've just been caught in a web, and I've been involved in supporting Native issues since I was 11 years old.
Ian Astbury.
Several sources I've come across claim the lawsuit was not successful, but remember guys, just because the lawsuit seems bogus, you still have to spend boatloads of money to defend yourself. The lawsuit would end up delaying the release of Ceremony in several countries outside of Europe, as well as North America, including Thailand and Singapore, which didn't see the record come out until 1992. Also hitting the band hard during the tour to support Ceremony was that the band's original drummer Nigel Preston, who left the band in 1985 after a business dispute, would die of a drug overdose in 1992. The band would soldier on, releasing their self-titled album in 1994, and much like Ceremony, their self-titled record was a test of wills. According to the Morning Call newspaper, who interviewed Astbury, he claimed he liked the band's self-titled album, but Duffy didn't. The album was more influenced by alternative rock, which was popular at the time. The frontman claimed the album was very personal for him, as he wrote about childhood trauma and the death of former bandmate and friend Nigel Preston. But the album barely made a dent on the charts, not even peaking in the top 40. Within a year of the album's release, the band soon fell apart while on tour. The final straw would come while the band was on the road in South America. According to guitarist Billy Duffy, who told Louder Sound, "We broke up in 1995. That was a real breakup. We were in South America and Ian just split. I think the problem was that neither of us were very comfortable with success. We're just not cut out for being pop stars. It's not something that either of us wanted," and the band would end up scrapping the rest of their South American tour dates and planned tour with the band Sponge. Side note guys, I've done a whole video on the band Sponge, the link is down below. Astbury would tell Newsday, "I left because I was exhausted after 12 years with co-founder Billy Duffy. I'd given everything I could in our relationship and made a lot of sacrifices in my life." The Cult wouldn't reform until the late 90s when the band's former drummer Matt Sorum, who played with Guns N' Roses, reconvened the band. Sorum would recall in his recently released book Double Talk and Jive how he got the Cult back together, revealing how one night he was watching TV and saw the band Buck Cherry performing on Jay Leno's Tonight Show, and he would end up calling his ex-bandmate Billy Duffy, saying, and I quote, "Billy," I said, "I just saw a band on TV and they're like a watered-down poor man's version of the Cult. I think rock and roll could be coming back." We talked through a lot of shit after that, what had been going on since I left GNR, what he was up to, which wasn't much. Eventually I said, "Let's get the band back together, let's book a tour and go to the press and say the Cult is back." Duffy agreed and soon reconnected with Astbury. Duffy would fly to LA and bunked with Sorum for a bit, and the Cult soon organized a sold-out theater tour, and it was around this time the record labels started sniffing around, including Atlantic and Warner Brothers. Up until this point in the Cult's career, they'd never been offered a $1 million record deal, and the most the band had previously gotten was around $100,000. The band would eventually sign a $1 million deal with Atlantic Records, and during Sorum's previous stint with the band, he was a hired gun and never played on any of the band's records. This time though, he was a full-fledged member and was making good money. The working title of the Cult's new album in 2000 was called Bring Me the Head of Dave Grohl, which was in reference to a recent interview that the Foo Fighters frontman had given, disparaging the band's live performances. As the band began to work on their new record, tensions were brewing in the studio once again. Bassist Martin Lenoble tried to contribute song ideas but quickly met resistance. Sorum would recall in his book, Billy would come up with a bunch of riffs and we began rehearsing. But then one day when our bassist Martin Lenoble said something like, "What do you think about trying this?" Billy just stared at him and without batting an eyelid said, "Ian and I write the songs for the Cult. You just play your bass and I'll give you the ideas." Each time we wrote songs, it was the same story. No one but Ian or Billy was allowed to say, and I remember Martin coming over to me one day and whispering, "Why are we even here?" "I don't know," I said with a shrug. Eventually Martin would leave the band and would be replaced by Chris Wise. Helping produce the record was old friend Bob Rock, who worked with the Cult on their 1989 record Sonic Temple, which was a smash success. The sessions for the record would drag on and eventually the band would temporarily relocate to Hawaii, where Bob Rock lived. Rock owned a studio perched over the hill overlooking the ocean, and the band would end up spending nearly $750,000 making the record, meaning there wasn't even $100,000 left over for each of the members. Released in 2001, the record was called Beyond Good and Evil and would mark the first Cult album in over 6 years. The album was a commercial disappointment, only peaking at number 26 on the album charts, and in the US it sold around 500,000 copies. Regardless, the band hit the road, and according to Sorum, Asbury and Duffy soon grew bored of being on tour. Despite having the opportunity to open for Aerosmith in 2001, Asbury seemed to sabotage every opportunity, even getting into an argument with Aerosmith's management and frontman Steven Tyler. Sorum would look back at this time in his book saying, "Every time we had an opportunity to go big, he completely effed it up. He was such a dark cloud, always hanging over us, and with every gig he got more and more sulky." The thing was, Ian could have been great if he only stopped destroying himself and singing about horses and butterflies, if he'd only written lyrics people could actually understand in America. With both him and another singer I would soon work with, that was the main issue. These guys could sing, but they were half their own downfall. As the tour wore on, Asbury was getting more out of shape as well. As the tour stretched on, the mood in the band only got worse, and with the 9/11 attacks impacting a lot of the tours around this time, the Cult canceled the planned European trek. Even by November of 2001, Asbury gave an interview in which he showed his indifference, with the article asking, "So what's next for the Cult?" With the singer sighing, "We're burnt." Eventually, the band was dropped by their record label and they pulled all support for the album, and the band once again split up. Despite Asbury hinting in 2004 that the band would never reunite, the band would get back together in 2006 and put out several new albums, including 2007's Born Into This, 2012's Choice of Weapon, 2016's Hidden City, and this year's Under the Midnight Sun. That does it for today's video, guys. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like button and subscribe. See you again in Rock and Roll Stories. Take care.